Oh, we're going to beat Ohio State on Saturday too. I don't know. I think we got their number. We'll see. They're going to come in here and boom. I'm hoping. I think it's going to be a good game, at least for 3 quarters. Okay, this is where we stopped. I'm going to go at a fairly rapid pace. The stuff that I'm going to finish up with on accident theory, then I'm going to get into OSHA a little bit. I updated some slides last night. That's why it was posted late. And then we're going to get into a little bit of the workers' comp, and then we're going to move back into the broader elements of ergonomics. But what I'm presenting to you, what I presented to you on Tuesday and what I'm presenting you today could actually be expanded into a course. So I recognize the material is rich. I recognize that there's a lot of material that is important for you of things, what it means with just so much you threw at me. But I can tell you for a fact, if I didn't do that, if we just went through the bullets and said, okay, this is what you need to know, and you coughed it back up, you wouldn't understand the relationship to that information as to where it came from and why it's important. So bear with me on that, and I'm hoping in the long run that it does pay off for you. So as you recall, I was working on accident theory in the last lecture, and we were talking about the 10 strategies to prevent loss. And looking at marshaling of energy, in this case here, trying to coordinate it, and if it's going to dissipate, have it dissipated in such a way that it doesn't come directly at you. And I use the example of the automobile, where you get into the newer models and so on, are getting very well designed. Although I thought it was really interesting that for years Toyota had a great safety standard, impact standard, and just this past year, their top 3 models completely fell out of the safety ratings modules in terms of where they were over the past decade. Not sure what happened there, cost cutting or who knows. But as many of you may know, that SIA, they also make the Toyota, or at least one version of the Toyota there. And to talk to the SIA people to make the Subarus and so on and so forth, they will mention that there has been some adjustments, if you will, in terms of cost, and maybe that has possibly impacted on some of the safety factors that we're seeing come out in the literature and in the latest impact test. But to me, I think cars have come a long way in terms of safety, and the more recent models, especially when you get into luxury models and so on, are very well cocooned, if you will, in terms of dissipating that energy and being able to have these inflatable bags and so on when you hit something. You want to reduce the amount of energy marshaled, prevent the release of the energy, so just keeping something contained. One of the things that is interesting here in terms of release of energy, it's a bit unsavory, but I want to share it with you. I was in Paris, France over the summer presenting some research, and I walked around, and some of the students are going to be working on this in this class. They had trash bags out at all these subway entrances and exits. And they have a very good underground system of transportation. And I noticed it was just a simple little ring, a simple little hoop ring, that the base was fastened to the ground, and the trash bag was right there. It was kind of a translucent green, which made it visually appealing. But all the trash could be seen right there. And I thought to myself, it's kind of interesting because most other places I traveled, I was in Orlando over the weekend, and I had a chance for a couple hours to go to the Epcot Center. And all around there, they have metal trash cans. All around Purdue, they have metal trash cans. And I said, are they just French being cheap right here, or they're just trying to clean up the streets or whatever? And we drilled down into the reason behind the idea of just the plastic bags and not the metal containers, and that is that it was a strategy to prevent shrapnel. And someone wanted to put an explosive device inside these trash cans. They became basically lethal devices in which an explosion would go off and people would get injured secondarily, not only by the explosion, but the shrapnel that would fly from these metal cans. And so all around Paris, that particular issue has been removed. So it doesn't prevent someone from putting something in there that can go off, but what it does do, it eliminates the shrapnel concept, unless, of course, they're mischievous enough to put something that has metal in it that it's going to go off, kind of like what happened in Boston. But it was, to me, one, it served the purpose. Number two, low cost. Three, it certainly cleaned up the streets of Paris. But something we may want to think about, as things go down the line, because you just never know the number of people out there that just have something against somebody, and you can be that anonymous person going by and something happens. So the idea of containing that energy, or at least minimizing the damage from a huge release of energy, is part of these kinds of strategies, certainly that example that I gave you in Paris. Modify the rate in which energy is released from its source, so a relief valve is helpful. Separate space and time of the energy being released from the structure that can be damaged, the human who can be injured. And that's an example that I gave just a little bit earlier in terms of space and time, distance being away from it. If we look at separation, let's see, separation of energy being released from a structure or a person can be suffered by putting a barrier. So basically anything that might possibly be explosive, there are these barriers that you can pose, called a line of sight barrier to prevent that from happening. Modify surfaces or structures that come into contact with people or other structures. Strengthen a structure, a person susceptible to damage. Detect damage quickly and during a period following damage, and to return to normal conditions. Take measures to restore to a stable condition. One of the things I want to point out at the top that's kind of interesting, if you've ever been over to the Burke Nanotechnology building, one of the things that they've done is that near the side where they have these large oxygen tanks, they have inside, they have basically what's called pressure relief walls. And if there's an explosion that occurs inside, the walls actually pivot out. They swing out just like they blow out on big hinges. And then at the very top, they have a glass ceiling. And it's actually heavy plexiglass. But they have a ceiling that where that release of energy goes, instead of basically blowing up that entire area, what happens is that energy goes out through the roof and through the sides, through these walls that basically are designed to release and let the energy dissipate. So clever design. So if you ever over to Burke Morgan, in that area, and you go to the Burke Nanotechnology Center, you go on the far end, you'll see those big oxygen tanks, and inside there are storage areas where these other tanks are kept. And that was part of the design idea, is to keep the building from blowing up, is to release the walls and the roof from where these containers are kept. So clever idea and design applied there. Hayden versus Heinrich. Hayden argues for a parallel model of preventive action. Heinrich goes for the serial model. And keep in mind, basically, when you look at Hayden, he's looking at a couple of things involved as a result of an incident or accident occurring, whereas when you look at the work done by Heinrich, he's more of the serial type, right? The domino kind of thing. You need one that leads to another, that leads to another, and so on. Both models work, but I solicit that because of the complexity of many things, it's not just one thing that can cause another, especially in today's world, especially dealing with technology. So parallel models then include multiple actions working at the same time. Serial is at one after another. Single factor theory, find the cause and you'll get the answer, right? A lot of times people look at this as a root cause analysis. And the other is find a theory is limited because contributing factors, the best corrective actions may be overlooked. So it says if you go all the way back and figure out what caused this thing and you go after that, the rest of the events may not occur. That may not be true. It may be another event that occurs and causes the accident, not the first thing. Multiple factor theory, accidents caused by many factors acting together. Immediate cause by unsafe act or unsafe condition. However, other characteristics of the accident come into play, such as age, height, gender, skill level, training, strength, motivation, emotional state of the worker, which can be transitory, and there are a number of others that can come into play. And this is the interaction right here of four system safety factors. We have management, man, the media, and the machine, all interacting right here leading to an adverse outcome. So know that all these things can come into play and interact with each other in terms of adverse outcomes. So prevention strategies and a reactive approach. Accident occurs and prevents actions are put into place to prevent recurrence of the same accident. And it goes like this. You have your accident, then you investigate why it occurred, you analyze why it occurred, and then you put preventive actions into place. And then the important thing here is that note that it goes back up. Darn it, thought I hit that. It goes back up to the accident itself. Did the preventive actions put in place now prevent these future occurrences? So you always have to have this feedback loop. Very important. Proactive approach, goal of keeping accidents from occurring in the first place. These are tough ones to make work, because a lot of times, people will say, well, justify the cost of this if it hasn't happened in the first place. And though in many of those kind of situations, and I'm speaking directly to my industrial hygienist here, if you're put in a situation where your job is to keep OSHA out of our hair, I don't care how much money they're paying you, I guarantee you the first thing that goes wrong, they're going to point it at you and say you didn't do enough. You didn't keep this from happening, and it's going to be your job, and you're liable. And you don't want that, especially if you have a fatality on the job or you have an injury on the job or something of that nature. Run like heck from those kind of employers, because the vast majority of them, in my experience, want to do the right thing. They realize that the workers are important to them. They realize what they do and they contribute to making a product, and they're invested in terms of skills and so on and so forth. But there are a small percentage of employers out there that find that looking at rules and regulations and so on and so forth are a nuisance, and if they can do some workarounds, and I'll show you that in the next lecture, they may take some of those actions to save a few bucks. But a lot of times what I found is that saving a few bucks and kind of clipping at that margin can result in something very unsavory and unfortunate. And more often than not, if they have someone who's on board, a hygienist, who signed off on something, it's going to come right back to them, and they're going to get blamed for it. Analysis of potential accidents, prevention program are put into place, and then the accident itself. All of these come into play in terms of being able to prevent this from occurring. Frequency strategy, focus on investigation analysis, preventive actions directed toward accidents and others. Example, 50% of all injuries occur to workers in their first year on the job. Then 50% of these occur in the first 3 months of the job. So your corrective action is that you're going to be really looking at the new workers, and your particular focus is going to be on the first 3 months, because that's what the data tell you that you need to do. You can see this in the literature. You don't have to experience this in order to implement a program. You can show that there's a huge cost savings if this is done on the front end. And if it's, unfortunately, if you have to come in on the back end showing all your data, that's not a good thing. But this is the kind of granulation that you want, and it basically says, with this amount of money, this is where I'm going to put a lot of my energy, right here on these folks, because that's where the problem is. Severity, strategy, focus on prevention, injuries, death, long-term disability, and so on. Serious incidents occur. There are 4 kinds. In the construction, non-productive activities, rarely done, unusual, non-routine work, or work involving high health risk. This would be like going into tanks and things of that nature with adverse atmospheres. And the problem with this is that because it occurs so rarely that it's sort of like the 1 in a million event. How can you prevent a 1 in a million event? How much is that going to cost, and so on? There's enough data that would help you basically calibrate yourself in such a way that we want to really prevent these things. So where would we attack the problem in terms of the industry that you may belong with. So, for example, as you know, I'm involved with the shipbuilding industry, and there's a lot of opportunities for huge releases of energy, you know, basically with welding tanks and so on, people being in holds where you might have argon gas and so on, where people could suffocate. And the idea is that, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on those things where something can go terribly wrong that we do a lot of, and we're going to put some investment in that with monitors and training and so on, and make sure that this thing doesn't occur. So it's that kind of strategy that you might use with severity, just because of the cost issues, and then making sure that it's something that the management will buy into. Pareto's law uses cost as the basis of measuring seriousness of an accident and its consequences, and not the injury itself. So the idea is that, remember when I showed you that graph last lecture where 50% of the cost were with only 2% of all those people getting injured, right? And so the majority of them, about 67 of the 100 workers, for example, you know, you were only up around 60% or so, and then from that point up to about 98%, what brought it up to 50%, and then that last 2% resulted in 50% more, right, adding to it for 100% of the cost. So the idea with Pareto's law would be to look at where all those costs are coming from that percentage of 67 up to 100, and focus on those. 3 E's of safety: engineering, education, and enforcement. Design it out, you can, is always the best thing, but making people aware of what they're working with is always helpful, and that should be continuing. And then, of course, enforcement, not only within the company, but also outside entities that can come in terms of consultants, as well as the government, state or federal. What's considered safe enough? That's really the big question, right? What is the risk? I had an interesting conversation. I was on a plane, I don't know, it was to Florida again. Coral Gables, I guess. Anyway, I was giving a talk. It all kind of comes together this a few weeks back. And I'm riding with a guy next to me who is the CEO of a moving company. And we had a very interesting conversation going back and forth. He said, yeah, we do have injuries because, you know, it's a moving business, of course, moving stuff from point A to point B. And I said, but, you know, there are ways in which you can reduce some of the hazards in this. I said, education's one, but there are some tools out there that can be used and so on, good techniques and practices. He said, yeah, he said, but in my business, there's a certain amount of acceptable risk that we're willing to take on, that because it is the business of what we're in, that in our own minds, we have a set point in terms of saying people can get injured up to a point because that's the business we're in. And I was just dumbfounded by that response, because it said, no, that's not acceptable. Any injury is not acceptable. I don't care what business that you're in, you can do a better job than what you're doing if you're smart about it. And maybe what's happening here, we didn't get into discussion, but I'm sure those costs are passed on to the customer. And you know, that's the thing that gets to me, is that, you know, you have to recognize the most precious thing you've got out there isn't your bottom line. The most precious thing you have out there is your workforce. And that's what you should be focused on. So you can see how that conversation went as we went on. Kind of a captive audience when they're sitting next to you. So many things are not clearly safe or unsafe. So we have to look into it. They'll fall into a region of uncertainty. So what do you consider acceptable? So what's clearly unsafe? What is acceptably safe? And then there's, of course, that range of uncertainty. And this is something that you all have to figure out yourself. Every time you get up in the morning, right, you say, well, I'm going to do certain things today, and I'm going to do certain things this week. And what I'm going to do is, in my own mind, I'm going to make a judgment about what's safe and what's not safe in terms of my behavior. As you know, I'm the chair of the Parking and Traffic Committee here at Purdue, and I'm sure a couple of you are saying, well, yeah, you're just a money maker out there. And they really don't. They operate at a loss. But the idea is to make the campus safer for you, and there's been some stuff on pedestrian safety and bicycles being integrated and poor pass markings and all this other stuff, and you can see some things are getting painted here and there and so on. And there's a lot of discussion in the committee about this kind of stuff. And part of it is what's acceptably safe. And they say, well, there's this issue about some of the students coming down from Hilltop Apartments on their bikes. And because they have a running start, they come flying down that hill. And then when they get down to Stadium, there's all this cross traffic going on, and they're like kamikazes just blasting through this traffic with the green lights going. And I'm saying, that's not smart. That's exciting, but that's not smart, right? And you know, sooner or later, it's just a matter of someone just not looking, and this bike comes out of nowhere, and bam, they get tagged. And we had an incident that occurred, I think it was last spring, with a bus. And the bus didn't hit the bicyclist hit the bus. And it was one of those long buses with the little accordion thing in the center. And they hit the back side of this thing. But the problem was that the bus driver didn't even see him. That bicyclist hit. And when that bicyclist hit, basically that person was kind of pulled under it. It was a mess. And it just, you know, I don't know why the bicyclist didn't see the bus, but it was just one of those things where they were flying and the bus was moving along, and bam, the two had an intersection, and it certainly didn't turn out very, very good at all. So the idea is that you ask yourself this question: what is safe for you? What's acceptable? I mean, you can't cocoon yourself and say, I'm not going to get out of bed today because everything out there is nasty, that kind of thing. But you have to make judgments, right? And the idea is that if it doesn't appear to be safe, it's not a good thing to do, then my recommendation is you back off from that and don't do it. You know, just take care of yourself. So it is a judgment call, but sometimes companies have policies and so on, decide what's acceptably safe. And that gentleman that I was able to talk to with that moving company said, you know what? Injuries are just a part of doing the business. And I'm thinking, man, could we spend some time together? I said, I got some other ideas about that. So just go through real quick. One of the things that I did with NIOSH before getting out was I was traveling all over the world and trying to look at why the American industry lost shipbuilding. We were the best shipbuilders in the world at one time, and we had all the shipbuilding, and then it's moved offshore, everything from passenger ships to our military ships. And we're trying to figure out why. So a couple of these will show you that these shipyards are very complex in terms of building these modules all over. And all up and down the East Coast, on the West Coast, and so on. And it's just a fascinating industry to get into. But you can see there are lots of hazards associated with building ships, you know, stairways, working overhead. You can see all the cords that are right here in terms of trip hazards and so on that are out there. A lot of this stuff has been cleaned up, by the way. Now they have overhead hook lines and things of that nature to get that cleaned up. But power tools being used, replacing those power tools, getting the best ones out there that do the job in terms of grinding operations and so on. Just you know, laying around. If you have them laying around like this, there's a chance they could vibrate off and fall on your feet, fall on your head, and so on. And then just basically looking at some of the controls. So you know, we call these little cherry pickers there to move up and down to access rather than using ladders. And then you can see some of the size of these ships as they get built and go along. So we went to Japan, and we started looking at their shipbuilding and what they did, and making a difference. And they build a lot of our military ships. Some of the destroyers and so on are built over there. They can build a ship over there in 2 years, and it takes us 4 years. And one of the main reasons why is because during World War II, all of their harbors were bombed and just laid waste. And what happened since then, they rebuilt all their harbors to be a lot bigger, and as a result of that, they can modularize now much greater, to a much greater capacity than we can. If you go to some of our shipyards, they're smaller, like Bath Iron Works, for example, in Bath, Maine. They were building, you know, wooden ships back in the day with masts and so on and so forth for sailing all around the world, and it hasn't changed one bit. I mean, obviously they've modified some of the berths and so on for launching these ships, but they're smaller. So they can still modularize, but not like they can in Japan. And that was part of it. The other part of it was just workflow and work organization that we found. They would, you can see, getting up and down and into and out of these ships for work. Cranes were all operated on a schedule. They knew exactly what was being lifted up and what was taken down. by the exact minute that was occurring, because they would have the horns go off and they had a schedule about what was happening. Welding operations and so on. Notice that he's doing welding operation, but he has exhaust ducts right here attached right near there to take away the welding fumes while they're working. Not a comfortable position to be in, but certainly avoiding exposure to some of these welding fumes. All these cables are tied off. They're not laying in the aisles, walkways, and so on. And then they had idea boards that they posted. This is something you may want to think about when you go out, is have employees give you their ideas, but then because of your training and skills is to have them organize it in such a way that here's a problem statement and here's a solution. Here's a photo of the problem, here's a solution, and be able to walk through that. And then you give recognition and awards for that kind of stuff. They do this now commonly, but it's done electronically at all the shipbuilding places in the United States. This is something the Japanese had pioneered. So the key differences, obviously shipbuilding, newer, they were larger. Work organization was huge. Energy, the flow between workers, machines, and parts was monitored and regulated. World markets, they build both military and civilian ships. Safety teams. And this was kind of interesting. They did walk-arounds on a routine basis where if they saw a problem, they would point it out and it would get fixed. A lot of times we just do our thing, and if something is a problem, it gets pointed out. But here it was actually done in an orchestrated way. And then safety was considered a vital link to productivity. The two were intermingled in such a way that it wasn't looked at as an attachment or an appendage to it. It was integral to their production. And that's the end of that lecture, that slide. This is in Vancouver, British Columbia, by the way. I don't know if you ever make it out that far on the West Coast. Absolutely gorgeous place to be. Okay, next thing. Tell you what we're going to do, because of the timing issue and switching over. Why don't you go ahead and do the quiz, and then we'll get into the next lecture. Boo. Nobody commented on my tie. Thought I'd get at least a comment from you or something about my little tie here. Do you know who this is? The artist? Edward Munch. And it's called The Scream. Far as we can. We're going to talk about the Act, and then standards, liability, and then workers' comp, as I mentioned. So when you look at OSHA, it's to ensure to the extent possible every working person in the United States has a safe and healthy work environment. Some of you know this by rote. It's important. It's under the Department of Labor, so you should, if you're not in this business, you should know that. And OSHA, that's the group that can issue the citations, right? There's another group out there you've heard about, NIOSH, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. That's not the group that issues citations. They do the research, and the idea was when they were put together is that NIOSH would kind of throw it over the fence and give it to OSHA, and they would help implement and enforce a lot of those standards or research practices. Purpose, encourage employers and employees to reduce hazards, implement new safety and health programs, improve safety and health programs, encourage research that will lead to innovative ways in dealing with workplace safety and health problems, establish the rights of employers and employees with regard to illnesses and injuries through a system of reporting and record keeping. And since I've been in the business, it started out as OSHA 100 forms. They now have OSHA 300 forms. They've been modified over time. And then finally, establishing training programs to increase the number of safety and health professionals to continuously improve their competence. That's one of the things that we have at Purdue. It's called a TPG, a training program grant, and it's put on by NIOSH. But the idea is that those that get their degrees, and Purdue has one of the world's only ABET undergraduate accredited program and graduate accredited programs. But the idea is that just about every one of those students who graduates gets a job. It's one of these bigger secrets that a lot of people don't know about. But the bigger thing is that when you look at me, and when the Act was created in 1970, and you run that time scale out, a lot of faculty now, a lot of people in the business are going into retirement. Not partial retirement, but real retirement, which means that there are thousands of jobs that are opening up, and it's going to accelerate in the next 3 or 4 years. It'll be interesting to see what happens to our program here, but it would be a shame to lose this opportunity when I can tell you that if you go into this profession, that I guarantee you not only a great job, but a job that pays well over the decades to the end of that, in which you're going to make a lot of really good money and have a great profession. That is, if you like the hands-on business of hygiene. A lot of people don't. But this is one of those things where you've got a turnover of a generation, and now you're handing it over to the next generation, and that new generation coming in can pretty much call their own shots in terms of how much money, where they want to work, and what kind of business they want to get into. So real interesting when you think about the training programs, my own little editorial on that. But we'll see who gets it and who doesn't for universities. So purpose of OSHA, we want to establish mandatory workplace safety and health standards and enforce them, develop and approve state-level workplace safety and health programs, monitor, analyze, and evaluate state-level safety and health program. What I have found as I travel around the country, a lot of the state-run programs have actually turned it over to the feds because if you have to have one, and the states have found, heck, let's just have the feds run it because we don't have to spend any money on it, and that's what I'm seeing more and more now. States that were run, Indiana has one, of course. They have some federal oversight, but more and more states I'm seeing now are just turning it over to the feds because it's far cheaper to have them do it than have the state run it. The Act covers all 50 states and the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and all other territories that fall under the jurisdiction of the government. And those who are, these are the exceptions. So I want you to pay attention to these exceptions. Because so often we think everybody's covered. They're not. Those that are self-employed, so consultants and so on their own. Family farms that employ only immediate members of the family. Does not apply to those farms that hire in outside people, but this is one of the reasons why, if you look in the literature right now, if any of you have access to a computer and you typed in hearing loss among farmers, that you're going to find a lot of the hearing loss is actually among the children because the children operate this noisy machinery and so on. Federal agencies covered by other statutes, and that's FOH. This Federal Occupational Health Program. I have a number of colleagues that have gone from the federal operations in terms of like OSHA or NIOSH into the Federal Occupational Health Programs, and they pretty much follow the same rules as OSHA, but they're obviously they guide federal workers. And then state and local governments, and most of that's because they have their own enforcement policies. OSHA develops standards based on the perception of need, request of other federal agencies, and OSHA uses a committee approach to developing standards. This sometimes can take years, and if you've looked at some of these committees in terms of implementation of standards, in my humble view, they've not done a very good job. And you have to wonder, well, how did they get so many standards to begin with? And this is a little inside thing, and I'm going to give it to you as a test question because I don't see it very often. And that is that most of the standards, OSHA standards, came from the TLVs. What TLVs stand for are threshold limit values from the ACGIH. And the ACGIH stands for the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. So when OSHA came into being in 1970, right there, they said, well, where are we going to go in terms of getting ourselves bootstrapped off the ground and moving forward? They took most of the recommended guidelines that were produced by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, called threshold limit values, and implemented those, and that became their portfolio of standards to begin with. And then since that time, they've moved on, they've tightened certain things such as silica, and so on, in some of the cancer compounds that have come out, such as chrome-6. But the truth of it is that when you see this big bolus of standards from 1970 versus what they've done today, it's pretty poor. It's very, very poor. Part of that has to do not with the lack of OSHA's will to implement more standards. It's just the legislation, in my opinion, is weak, and it takes them, by consensus, a long time to move from one point to the other in terms of implementing any changes out there. And this is the National Advisory Committee on Safety and Health is their advisory group. Oh, sorry about that. And they also have one on construction and safety. Sorry about overlapping my writing with that. OSHA can take different types of action on standards. A standard may be adopted, amended, or revoked. So as I mentioned to you, many of the standards from the ACGIH were adopted, and many of those that were brought in were amended, and then some can be completely thrown out. And what standard in this class was thrown out, actually became law? The ergonomic standard, right? It was a standard for about 90 days. It was out there. It was law. Yes? No. It does not. It can, but it can be revoked by Congress. Okay, so you don't have to it doesn't have to be approved by Congress, but because of the way the laws are written is that if something is totally egregious, and this is called the Congressional Review Act, if you remember what I talked about earlier, and this, ironically, was actually developed by the Clinton administration, is that if some law or act comes out that's so egregious that it is a hindrance to the development of the economy and to businesses, then collectively Congress, the Senate, and the President have to vote against it, and then it can be rescinded. And that's exactly what happened, because after Clinton left office, President Bush came in, and as you recall back then, the majority of the Congress was Republican, the majority of the Senate was Republican, and they had the trifecta. So, and they had 90 days to get rid of it, and within 90 days, that was gone. So there is a process, and I'll show you that with OSHA. Thanks for the question. That can take years, and that if someone finds a certain element that it can be challenged in the courts, this is where it really gets challenged in the courts, it can get thrown back into the cycle and take years more before it ever finally comes out as an approved standard, because all the stakeholders will have a chance at commenting on it, those for and against it. And if you Googled me and did OSHA testimonies and so on, you'll see that I've given quite a bit over the years in support of various things going forward, or things to consider before something went forward. So before any of these actions then can take place then, it has to be published in the Federal Register, and it has two options for meeting this requirement. It's called Notice of Proposed Rulemaking and Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So this is the first time that industry sees formally that OSHA is going to come out with something in the Federal Register and said, we are going to propose the following. Or we're letting you know that we're going to propose the following. That's the difference on the advanced proposal of rulemaking. So it gives industry a heads up that something's about to happen. This is the landing page for OSHA. If you went on to OSHA.gov, this is what you'd see today. This is what I loaded last night. Interesting, when you look at these things, one of their focus areas is protecting workers from chemicals, and then, of course, preventing falls and constructions, which is a perennial thing that you see up quite a bit. But one of the things I noticed when I was looking through this is this. It just, to me, it's a little too small. But when I think of all the men and women who didn't come home after a day at work because they died on the job, 4,383 workers died on the job in 2012. They went to work and they never came home. Directly work-related. To me, way too high a price to pay that could have been prevented. Date of appeals. Once the standard has been passed, it becomes effective on the date prescribed. However, a person who is opposed to that standard can file an appeal in the Court of Appeals serving the geographical region in which the complaint lives and does business, and the appeal must be initiated within 60 days of the standard's approval. So you see what I was talking about with the Congressional Review Act, where that came in. In this case, obviously the appeal had to be filed, but it had 90 days, basically, to get cleared from the books. Temporary compliance variances. When an employer is unable to comply with a new standard immediately, they give them time. The variance is requested. OSHA can grant a variance for a maximum of up to 1 year. And this is granted quite often by companies. For example, if they have exposure standards within a plant, they have to modify their controls in terms of bag houses and so on, that financially it's not feasible for a company to do that, then they're given a little bit of time to make those changes. Permanent compliance variances. Employees who feel that their workplace already exceeds the requirements of a new standard can request a permanent variance and must present their evidence to OSHA for inspection. Most of this is air sampling driven in terms of exposure assessments and so on, showing that they have the controls in place and that their standards, and many companies, in fact, many of them around here, Greater Lafayette, Alcoa, Caterpillar, SIA, and so on. SIA, in my opinion, they are an amazing company because of their going green thing, is that they went from this whole recycling campaign to a moneymaker now in which they, almost nothing, goes into a landfill. Just amazing. And from that, they've improved their safety and health standards and so on and so forth. But to me, that's an example of a company, notwithstanding the other ones that I mentioned, that has gone above and beyond what OSHA is asking of them to do. Why? Because they have found that safety and health makes money. And when they incorporate it into their overall production, it makes for a recipe for success. Reporting. OSHA provides centralization and systematization of the standard record-keeping process. And this is key. Requires Act 11. Okay, look at that number. 11 or more workers. These are the ones that are involved in reporting. Okay, so I'll test you on that. Both exempt and non-exempt employers must report following types of accidents within 8 hours. Okay, that's another number I'm going to give you. Those that result in fatalities. Those that result in hospitalization of 3 or more employees. These are easy test questions, so write them down. Occupational illnesses and injuries must be reported if one or more of the following occur. Death of one or more workers, 1 or more days away from work for the employees, so look at that, 1 or more. Restricted motion or restrictions to the work an employee can do. Some companies play a little trick with that and sort of have you sort of, okay, go out, get looked at, why don't you come on back in and do some light duty, that kind of thing, rather than going home. If they go home, that has to be reported, right? And so musculoskeletal injuries come into play with this. Loss of consciousness to 1 or more workers. Transfer of an employee to another job because of a workplace illness or injury when they're transferred, not when it's being done for maybe promotion or something like that. It's resulting from illness or injuries. Okay, so keep that in mind. Medical treatment needed beyond in-house first aid. And again, sometimes companies will play that game a little bit and say, well, why don't you go to the dispensary and see what can be done and sort of keep them there and see if they can be treated and they can go home. And then if it's on a Friday, then let's see if that person is okay by coming back on Monday, right? Or on a Thursday if they want to take Friday off, that kind of thing. So does it happen often? No. But it does happen, so it's important to keep that in mind. And appear in Appendix B of the OSHA Act, and that Appendix B means reporting of any injuries or illnesses that are required for reporting in the Act itself. Forms. There are a number of forms out there, but the ones I mentioned to you that they have now is the 300, the 301, and the 301A. These are amended forms here in terms of giving you more details about the injuries and illnesses that occur on the job. Posting, it's required. Got to be displayed. There's an OSHA poster. Then there are summaries of variances request of all types, so that has to be posted if a variance has been requested and the person might be exposed to it. And then copies of all OSHA citations received for failure to meet standards. That's required. And then, of course, a summary page of the 300 forms. So one of the tips I want to give you, if you're going into a place of employment, a lot of times they have these employee break rooms and so on. Just look up on the board. They'll have an OSHA poster up there. That's required. If there are any variances, they'll have that posted. But probably the thing I always look at is that summary page of the OSHA 300 form. That's required. Is it what injury experience did that company have over the past year? And a lot of times what I like to do is I go back and I compare them to the industry norms to see if they're above or below that and if they're doing the right thing. Inspections. Compliance officers are authorized to take the following actions. Enter at a reasonable time on site. That can vary. If a company is being resistant to this first time, you come out, you go in, and I've had this happen, going with compliance officers. You go up, you're polite, you go to the entrance, you say, may we come in, we want to do an inspection. They'll say, no, I don't think so. Then what you can do is you can come back at midnight with a court order and say, now we're going to come in and we're going to do a little walk around here and we're going to have some evaluation of your work facilities. And so in most instances, and this is about better than 90% of my experience, is that you come in, usually you call them ahead of time, and you're going to come in, you tell them what the purpose is, your opening meetings and so on. You do your walk-arounds, and then you give them information. You inspect at a reasonable time, condition of facility, machine, or equipment, and question in private any employee. So you have a break room or someplace to go to talk to them privately about what's going on. Citations, other than serious ones, willful violations, not so good. Repeat violations, even worse. Failure to correct prior violations, they really start coming after you then. And the de minimis violations, is basically those things that are important, but usually the courts don't take up. So these are small violations, but important ones that should be corrected in order to prevent something greater from happening. So I pulled this off. Let's see. Yeah, this is came out August 2013, right here. And this is they post these companies if they have some issues. So Hagel Metal Fabrication was cited for willful violations after workers fatally crushed by an unguarded machine at an Illinois plant. The thing was, I believe it was a laser cutter, and the willful violation includes bypassing machine safeguards on, here we are, machine safeguards on 2 laser cutting machines, and the failures to lock out sources of hazardous machinery and energy. And the problem is that it's a big difference. One is just a violation of that, and another is a willful violation, in other words, removing the safeguards that were there. And it goes all the way down, and it just sort of spells all this out, and it says, but here's the thing that shocked me a little bit. The guy died, right? But this is what they were charged, $317,000. I don't know about you, but that to me, it's a constraint within the regulations about how much someone can be fined and so on. But we're talking about a willful violation, and someone died on the job. What's going to happen, was probably has happened in this situation, is that there are attorneys now, probably from the survivors with this employee, former employee, who are probably now going after the company for a much greater amount as a result of the loss of that person's life. Because what sets precedent here is that OSHA recognized and fined this company for a willful violation. So it's a pretty big deal. Not only that, the world sees this company. I'm sure they're not real happy about this at all. Certainly they wouldn't be happy about the loss of that individual's life. But the fact that they are on record now by OSHA as a willful violation indicates that this company is probably paying a lot more than just what you see right there. But it is interesting to me that this is what the government can find, and I'm sure they were constrained in terms of that amount. Appeals, employee appeals regarding the workplace amount of time, the abatement period given to an employer to correct a hazardous situation, and also a request for an extension on that abatement period. So if they come in and say, we want you to get this cleaned up in 3 months or 6 months, and they can file appeal to that and say, listen, it's going to take us almost a year because you're requiring new machinery, this or that, or you're asking us to do something in terms of training, but what we want to do is eliminate it altogether and buy a new machine to take care of the problem for once and for all. A lot of times OSHA will allow that appeal to go forward and give them an extended period of time for abatement. Employer petitions for modification of abatement, contest a citation. In most of the situations I've been involved with, I've seen contesting of citations going in where it comes in at a certain number and it gets reduced based upon the back and forth between the company and with OSHA. Safety and health programs, states are allowed to develop their own. As an incentive, OSHA will fund up to 50% of the cost of operating a state program with approved plans. This was a pretty big deal for a lot of states because you think it's only going to cost me half as much if I run it through by myself. I have control over it because the feds are basically offsetting 50% of those costs. Some states will say, you know, that was just still too much. We're going to have the feds come in and cover 100% of the cost. Setting standards. Setting standards, inspecting compliance. OSHA provides services to employers to meet the latest safety and health standards. And these are no cost to the companies, particularly those with hazardous processes or materials. Services available. Consultation. This has actually gone down. In this administration, less consultation from OSHA. Most of their thing, if you really look at trends, and I've been looking at this for a long time, their big thing now is record-keeping violations and non-compliance with existing standards out there. I always thought the consultation program made a lot of sense in terms of the back and forth between industry and OSHA, but budgets are not there for that. Volunteer inspection programs, that's also gone down. Still there, though. Training and education, always important, not as much of that. Detractors from OSHA, there are detractors, of course. And some characterize OSHA as overbearing, little or no sensitivity to employers who are struggling to be competitive in the market. Others label OSHA as timid and claim it does not do enough. Different times and different places, both points of view have probably been played out. In my view, I think OSHA is probably doing the best that it can given the resources that it has. When you look at the number of compliance officers at the federal and state level, and you look at the number of industries in this country, especially when we're looking at, what, 11 or more employees, right, that would be eligible for an inspection, it's virtually impossible for them to get out there and do the job that's really needed. The good news is that, in my experience, the majority of employers have done the right thing by taking care of their employees. And so you're now dealing with some of the bad actors out there that just have this thing that they feel that having someone coming in and telling them how to do their business is wrong. And if you put the whole thing together, what I showed you earlier about consulting, providing information, training, and so on and so forth, I think when you look at it in its total state, to me, it's something that on balance is doing, I think, the best they can given the resources that they have. So could they do better? Yes. But they got a tough job. So excuse me. Other agencies play important roles. NIOSH, by the way, for all of you that aren't acquainted, one of the big bugaboos with NIOSH, they know, if you know them or not, is that it is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, not the National Institute of. You'll see that a lot. It's for. It's more active, right? It's for. It's an advocate for the workers and for the workplace. Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission, an independent board that looks at, it's appointed by the President, and this is a quasi-judicial authority to handle contested citations. Standards and codes are an important role to play in safety and health management, written procedures for safety and health on the job. Standards, operational principle criterion, code, set of standards, fundamental legal principles, negligence, liability, care, ability to pay, damages, proximate cause, willful reckless conduct, tort laws, this is case law right here, feasibility or foreseeability, could you foresee that? Remember that example I gave you about the lawnmowers, right? And basically going after some of the engine manufacturers saying you should have been able to foresee the fact that someone would put up a Velcro strap to lock that down so that when you released it, it wouldn't kill the engine. All these things come into play.